Well, the time is just gone 7 p.m. and it is Wednesday night with myself, Inequality. Assalamu alaikum and good evening to one and all. To our listeners, our viewers on the various platforms of Salam Media, wonderful having you with us once again this evening. Now, the major talking point in South Africa has been the budget 2023, the national budget speech that was delivered by the Finance Minister, Konongwana. And this was a very, very important budget considering where we are at this point in time. And just like the SONA, where South Africans waited with bated breath to hear what the president had to say, this time around, the finance minister presenting the budget. Now, looking at the budget, it is clear that the budget had touched on many points, many topics, and one of the key issues is to look at South Africa, our economic standing in the country, and also at the same time as to the future, where are we as far as growth is concerned. Now, the main talking point was the case during the State of the Nation address, has been Eskom in the budget address of the finance minister. And South Africa at this point in time, we are at the crossroads, we are at a tipping point. And with the continued rolling blackouts that we are experiencing, this appears to be the main threat to the economic growth of the country. And this is what we are doing this evening in terms of unpacking the budget and what does this actually mean for the country and going forward. And we are actually in the company of our panelists this evening to try and make sense of what the finance minister had to say, but also at the same time looking at reaction and to see exactly how this budget is actually seen. Is it investor friendly? How is it seen by the population at large in the country? How is it seen by those who are unemployed? Is there hope in this country as far as the budget is concerned? So without much ado, we are going across now to be joined by our analysts this evening. We are joined by Thoko Madonko, who is a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, and also Orin Tambo, who is the head of investment strategy at 274. Both my guests are coming up on screen. I see Thoko Zile with us right at the top of the screen. Thoko, good evening to you and welcome to the show.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
And Orin, good evening to you as well, and wonderful that you're able to join us this evening.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
Right, Thoko, let's start with you and just, your overall or your initial reaction to what the finance minister had to say before we actually go into some of the detail.
I think the most important thing is that this was an Eskom budget. That's what we were expecting. It's what we were anticipating the minister speak on, particularly after the President's State of the Nation address. We needed to see leadership on Eskom. Eskom is a threat to our economy and to the livelihoods of the very poor in this country as well. So it is good to see that Eskom has come through and that we'll be taking on greater leadership through Treasury on how Eskom is managed going forward. Having said that, there's still a great deal of uncertainty around what it will look like, how this will play out over the outer years. But the second part of this mixed bag budget as well is that we didn't see, unfortunately, we did not see real increases or above inflation increases to the social wage. So we don't see a kind of injection of resources to education, health, social development that is needed to be able to provide quality public services to the majority of the citizens. And so this is a real double-edged sword in terms of sorting out Eskom, but then not enough is being done to deal with those in most need, the poor in particular.
Thank you for that, Thoko, and let's bring Orin into the discussion. Orin, just your initial thoughts before we get into detail.
Yeah, so I think, just coming from asset allocator point of view as an investor, I totally agree with Thoko that there were positives and negatives. From an asset allocator point of view, I think the initiatives that have been put forward around the energy crisis, particularly around ESCOM. It's something that we're also expecting. And I think it has also been done in a smart or prudent way, in the sense that, the budget is providing for the take-on of 254 billion of the debt that ESCOM is currently holding, and that's going to be done over a period of 3 years. And I think that was quite smart. So it's very important for us as investors. We believe that, it's going to be viewed positively, because the way we've been thinking about it, if they'd come with this sort of initiative 10 years ago, I don't think a lot of investors in South Africa are going to welcome it. But after experiencing load shedding over the past few years, the cost of load shedding at this point is actually much larger than 254 billion. So you think that it's a worthy sacrifice from the balance sheet point of view. So that was one issue that we liked. We also believe that, one thing that we always look at is the government doing what it's doing in a fiscally sustainable way. And when you look at the projected expenditures versus the projected revenues, we see that there is not much increase, especially in terms of the budget deficit. The budget deficit is actually going to narrow over the period, which we believe that is quite good, and even the credit ratings might actually view that positively. And finally, just as a key highlight as well from investors that I think would like is the fact that the fiscal policy is supposed to come through and try and reignite the economy. So there should be policies within any fiscal policy to try and restart the economy, which that is under pressure at the moment. And if we look at it, I think there are a couple of things that small things that were slotted into the budget. For instance, if you think about the tax incentives around the procurement of solar panels, as well as the tax incentives that have been provided for business, we think that eventually, that's going to boost the capital investment into the economy. They've also provided some sort of tax relief for consumers. It's not much, but again, I think it's going to boost consumer spend, and more importantly, the extension of the COVID relief to 2024. They've increased the amount which is supporting that particular aspect. We also believe that's quite positive. So I think that there were generally, I think, some of the positive things that investors would like. I was just looking at the rand, during the presentation. At some point, during the day, it was at about 18.3 to the dollar. And by the time the presentation finished, I think it was at around 18.1, which means that there's quite a lot of investors who probably appreciate some of the initiatives brought forward by the minister.
Well, obviously, one would have expected the minister to find a balance, Thoko, in presenting the budget, because this budget comes at a time when, we're looking at a very difficult domestic and a global economic environment. And he had to find a balance in some way or the other. And as Orin alluded to, investors, and this is what the president has been talking about as well, to try and boost investor confidence in the country. But at the same time, we are looking at two extremes, where on the one hand, we are faced with a global problem, but the domestic problem in the short term is not going to be solved. And I think this is where your concerns are, that has the budget done enough? We're speaking about the extension of the the grants, the 350 Rand grant, those things, but they're not enough. At the end of the day, a pensioner, just 100 Rand increase a month on the pension, how does a pensioner still survive? The money that is being paid in terms of social grants is still not enough.
Absolutely. And I think this calls into question, we need to have a frank conversation around our fiscal policy. So we've been pursuing a policy of fiscal consolidation and essentially creating a very small space for the state in the broader economy. And so we see very fixed rates to tax to GDP, to expenditure to GDP, even our deficit. And so we're seeing this real clamping down on the ability of the state to act in the economy. And part of that acting is to think about investing in social production, in social services, in the social wage. And so when we look at compensation of employees, for example, which has been a big ticket item, it's often referred to as a cost, not an investment. the grants are considered a cost, a burden to the fiscus as opposed to an investment. So the extension of the social relief of distress is absolutely critical. It was demanded, it's needed, but it's only for 1 more year. So we need greater policy clarity from government, and Treasury can put this squarely onto the role it plays within the broader policy framework. But we really need to see this real policy decision to include something like a universal basic income grant. Given the levels of inequality, given the levels of poverty, we need to see that as putting money into the pockets of individuals, primarily poor households, primarily women, to be able to participate actively in the economy. By withdrawing the state from the economy, you're also withdrawing those investments. And we see this again in health, in education, real cuts across the board that is felt the most at the provincial level. And those cuts result in longer waiting times, poorer delivery of services, pressure on nurses and teachers. Our population is not decreasing. We have increasing population. We've got population growth, so the needs are greater. And we're seeing this below inflation injection that is just keeping what little is available ticking over, and that's not enough. But having said that, Orin is correct. There are some small nuggets where we've seen some injection. So the focus on infrastructure is, I think it's over 903 billion in infrastructure. Most of it is going to the SOEs. But if we saw that being directed and actually spent at the local level to broaden our public transport systems, to improve our health facilities, to green our schools, to start creating efficiency gains by enabling people to be employed in ways that delivers on these social services, then we would have a much more vibrant set of policies than we currently have. At the moment, somebody will often say to me, so where's the money going to come from? That's another nugget that we need to look at. We have to look at our tax policy and how that policy is made up of corporate income tax, personal income tax, VAT. Is this the right mix for a developmental state? We're seeing, and one of the things that we do welcome is the clamping down on illicit financial activities. This is absolutely critical, and we welcome the additional funds. Because we are losing up to, I think sub-Saharan Africa loses something around $1 trillion a year to illicit financial flows. So we also need to start looking at the revenue side of this fiscal consolidation story, because at the moment it is being financed on the back of expenditure cuts, and that's not what we need as a state. In South Africa, our developmental needs are such that we need to be pumping good resources into the right places at the right time, and to be rolling back on health, education, social development. These are huge, potentially housing. These are huge areas of expenditure that hurt the poor, essentially. So yes, the creditors for Eskom are very happy, and we need them to be happy. But we also need the average South African living and working to be happy, to see their grants as something that enables them to actively engage. And below inflation increases, below food inflation, means that households are poorer than they were last year, despite a 30 Rand increase to the child support grant. 30 Rand is not going to go very far. So we really need to have a debate about this fiscal consolidation as a policy, and what other options, what alternatives are there available to us to be able to get resources to where they need to be.
Yes, and also, Oren, as Thokozile mentioned, this was largely an ESCOM budget, and when we drill down, obviously the tax rebate, the incentives are there for individuals and for businesses to go solar, and one would actually argue that these benefits will be enjoyed by people, obviously who can afford solar panels, by businesses who can afford solar panels. Now, these are the only people that may benefit from this incentive or the rebate that the minister has been speaking about. But what about the millions of poor people who have also suffered as a result of load shedding?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the issues that my team was actually discussing this morning. I mean, just indicating that it's going to have a disproportionate effect because for you to be able to benefit from the tax incentive, if you're an individual, you need to go and procure the solar panels or the solar system. And not a lot of people can afford to buy the solar system. The same applies to businesses. Probably through businesses, that's when some of the poor could benefit. But I think another way of looking at it tonight is that what the government is trying to do is to look at the problem that we're currently having at Eskom, just to drill it down to basics. We have got currently a capacity constraint problem at Eskom, in the sense that the generation capacity that we have as a country is not adequate for the demand that we're having. And this is happening when the economy is not even growing at very decent growth rates, right? So that's the first problem that we're currently having. The second issue that we have, obviously, I think we had issues around competence at Eskom. There've been a lot of talk about the lack of skills at Eskom, which is a different issue and it requires different policy framework to address. But just coming back to the issue of the supply constraints, what the government is doing, in my view here, is the fact that if those people that can afford to buy solar panels, they will benefit from the tax incentives. But what they do is that they provide a relief on the grid. So if you're going to have a lot of businesses essentially investing into renewable energy, hoping that renewable energy is going to be providing them with energy throughout the day, it basically means that the capacity that Eskom have can now be diverted to provide those communities that cannot afford on their own. So yes, I want to believe that directly it doesn't benefit everyone in terms of these financial incentives, but I think there is an indirect benefit that everybody else is going to get. But I totally agree that the National Treasury probably have to sit down and rethink and see if there are ways that they could also try to cascade to other sections of the society that won't be able to buy these the equipment.
Yes, and also Thoko, just coming back to the winners and the losers of the budget, and it is clear that Eskom, the SOEs, the likes of the Land Bank, and we've even heard of the SAA getting another R1 billion bailout. Now, have we not learned our lessons where we've seen bailout after bailout, and this has now come to a situation where further bailouts are actually needed by these SOEs, and we all know the reasons why, and we don't even have to go there. Orin spoke about the lack of skills, but also in terms of just how badly managed these SOEs have been in the past, cadre appointments. All of this has basically contributed, and the key issue here is oversight. The president spoke in his State of the Nation address. He spoke about the Auditor General oversight over Eskom. And so he hinted at that point in time that we're going to help Eskom out, but we're going to be having oversight. We got the Auditor General involved. It's just, at this point in time, it's talk, but it's going to be the time to walk the talk. And I think that is exactly what the country is actually looking at, when you're pumping all this additional money in bailing out these SOEs.
I think that's a very critical point, and it comes to partly talking about transparency issues and around access to information. And one of the advantages of having Eskom on the main budget books is that we have greater scrutiny. It goes through Parliament, and Parliament itself has greater scrutiny over the budget numbers. And so you'll see that a specific bill is being passed for the bailout, which gives us greater opportunities to pay closer attention to what is happening. And we can see that Treasury is very clear in the budget documents today, and the minister mentioned it as well, that they are going to be very disciplined themselves in relation to how the monies are dispersed in the case of Eskom. Of course, we need to see what will happen with SAA, with Transnet, so yes, there's all of these other SOEs that are bubbling up and waiting to cause problems further down the line. Hopefully, we are learning from the process of Eskom to do it better, to do it smarter. Like Orin was saying, being able to put it onto the books, create a clear balance sheet, create a clear accountability mechanism so that South Africans understand what is being committed to. So yes, there's still uncertainties with the Eskom bailout. We're not 100% clear how it all looks and what will happen. And it has huge market ramifications. But at least we're at the first step of seeing a bill, of seeing what the agreement is. There's great information in the explanatory documents detailing what steps Treasury will take at each of the meetings and what the restrictions are. So Eskom cannot take on any new debt if it takes on this arrangement. So, they really are, and there won't be any new builds, huge infrastructure builds under Eskom. So that, again, is something that is welcomed. But again, we also welcome the increase in resources, a little bit, not a lot, to the national prosecuting authorities. That is needed. We need to be watching for illicit and money laundering and illegal activities. So those are the kinds of things that, with a stronger SARS, and we've already seen the reforms that have been taking place with the South African Revenue Service, that we've seen an increase in compliance. We need a strong SARS. We need a strong SARS that can monitor the behavior of those who want to loot our state. And that the stronger SARS is combined with other agencies responsible for monitoring corruption and illicit and illegal activity, I think we'll be in a much better position. But again, it takes political will and it takes political leadership.
Well, certainly, and also, Oren, as Tafazile mentions, that we need a strong SARS. But we know that for years now, SARS has been pretty good in terms of collection, in terms of getting the revenues in. But the problem is when that money comes in, how that money is spent. And I think this is where we have a problem.
Yeah, totally. So, before you even go to how the money is spent, I think one of the key problems is the tax base. That's one area that we need to really address as a country. So currently, I think we've got about 2.5 million South Africans are probably, supporting about 80% in some of the studies that I've seen of the tax burden. So we've got very few people that are contributing taxes from a personal income tax point of view. And then we've got also corporates, that are not, that are also contributing. But at the end of the day, I think what we need is to address that tax base. And, the biggest question that you have, obviously, is how can you address the tax base of the country? You need to grow the economy. That's the key. And we understand that, some, when it comes to policies that are needed to grow the economy, you probably won't find those policies in the fiscal policy that has been, announced by the finance minister, but they should come from the State of the Nation address. They should come from the political leaders, from the government itself. They should come up with policies. And in South Africa, as investors, for so many years at NEDLEC, we've got also international organizations like the IMF, the World Bank. They have identified what South Africa needs to be able to grow it above 3%. They have said that there are certain reforms that the country needs to implement. And when President Ramaphosa, for instance, was elected in 2017, there was that Ramaphoria with everybody saying, because he talked about those, those reforms, that the structural reforms that are needed for the country to move forward. Yes, some of them have been implemented. Now we have in the energy reform. I think the spectrum issue has been addressed, but a lot of them haven't. In some cases, of seen deterioration. For instance, if you look at the transport network, because it was one of the key areas, I understand that there's something that's, some of the issues that are going on there. But that's the first key thing. We need to make sure that, we address the tax base. And moving on now to the expenditure side, you're absolutely right. We need to have, accountability mechanisms. Right now, whenever the government talks about some sort of spend, everybody gets concerned, especially when you look at what happened to the COVID stimulus that was provided in the economy. We know that there was looting within the government, there was a lot of corruption. So we need to make sure that, when it comes to spend, that money is going to be spent for what it's supposed to. And we need those mechanisms. And I think going back to a point that was raised in the sense that when you look at the money that has been allocated, the NPA, we need to capacitate the NPA to be able to start prosecuting and getting convictions on some of these corruption cases. Right now, to be quite honest, and I've got a friend of mine, he always talks about, if you compare South Africa to, for instance, a country like Japan. In Japan, when it comes to economic crimes, they've got a conviction rate of close to 90%. And when you look at South Africa, especially the NPA, in terms of these economic crimes, we find that the conviction rate is very low. And there's a need for skills. I think, the NPA, the director itself has come out and said they need certain skills for them to be able to do that, to be able to bring down some of these, criminals. So that there is need for us to make sure that if we have got, we're struggling as a country, and the coffers are somewhat constrained because there's quite a lot of competing uses out there, and at the end of the day, when an allocation is made to a particular cause, it has to go to that cause, and so that we see the results at the end of the day.
Yes, and also I think, Thoko, when one looks at the number of people that are receiving these social grants, close on to 20 million people, which is a third of the country's population. And what we would have liked to see over the years is this number actually come down, where less people place reliance on the government. And that obviously comes with stimulating the economy, creating jobs. You spoke about infrastructure development. And for me, that didn't seem to, I know the government spoke a bit about job creation, they spoke about the youth, young people, but that didn't come very, very strong in the minister's address in terms of job creation being a key focus area.
Absolutely. I mean, it's partly taken care of in the assumption that the investments in infrastructure will bring about some growth in jobs, and they talk about the public-private partnerships that they're seeking to be able to leverage private investment into the economy to try and drive greater projects around that are employment generating. South Africa has been cursed with something known as jobless growth, which really speaks to the nature and form of our economy, the structure of the economy. And a very important economist, African economist, Madonko, has argued that economies like South Africa suffer from three deficits, and they're structural deficits. We don't have energy sovereignty. As we see, we're trying to deal with it through Eskom, and then through hopefully through a greening program, through the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Project, that hopefully will generate clean energy, but also alleviate energy poverty, but also create jobs. So, I mean, we need to really deal with our energy sovereignty, seeing the dependence on diesel and how much that's costing. We need to be able to move that off and be able to be independent. The second area is around our trade. We have insufficient industrial policy, essentially. So we don't have our own vibrant, circular economies that enable us to have our own manufacturing, our own sustainable green types of industries that can supply what is needed in a fair and just way in the region. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a critical thing to watch as it's attempting to address it. The SADC has the common framework. So there are aspects of which we need to be looking south In fact, Fadal Kabub says we need to decolonize our economies. We need to look inwards in order to be able to strengthen. And by depending on tourism, for example, just means we become dependent on something that can be subject to the COVID crisis. It makes us too vulnerable. So yes, tourism is great, but it shouldn't be like a driver of growth as a growth strategy. So we need to deal with young people's abilities to access good quality jobs. And then the third area that he focuses on is that we need to really look at our social investments. So looking at how we structure our overall budget or fiscal framework to cater for social services given our developmental needs. And so that again is a huge driver. And under feminist economics, we argue that investing in social services is investing in jobs, investing in care work, investing in a nurse, investing in somebody who can clean the sidewalk, and that these are well-paid jobs. These are jobs of firefighters, especially as we come into greater and greater climate shocks. These are jobs that public services should be providing and we should be investing in. And they're also green. They're less polluting. A nurse is less polluting than investing in some of these higher kind of extractive type industries. We need to start thinking creatively about our industrial policy and how that industrial policy links to our monetary and fiscal policy. So these things need to work together in more harmonious ways. At the moment, we're almost pulling in 5 different directions, and in the interim, the real vulnerable are being pulled in multiple ways and seeing their services, their state essentially disappear before them.
Yes, and also, Oren, when one looks at government spending and the proposals that have come through in the budget, we know that the biggest spend obviously is on social development, but the second biggest spend is on debt servicing costs. We're talking of a figure of 340 billion. And we wonder whether we are ever going to get out of the debt trap that we find ourselves in, because this is money that is going just in servicing debt. It is not productive. It is could have been directed to other areas, whether we talk about health, education, infrastructure, for whatever reason or the other. And it is clear from this that this country cannot afford any more debt as well, because this is going to be a bottomless pit in a never-ending cycle.
Yeah, that's correct. I think it's something that you created many years ago. So, we've been analyzing the South African economy in terms of where we actually started getting it wrong, from 1994. And I think one thing that comes out very strongly is that when you go to early 2000, when you had a commodity boom, we should have at that point used some of the money that we got during that period to try and service our debt, but we didn't. And then you've got 2008, which came, and obviously the economy collapsed. And after that, it was just one way. That's when you saw our debt spiraling to the level where we are currently. So if you look at South Africa, I mean, we're talking about our debt to GDP sitting at around 69, 70 something percent. And normally for a country, for an emerging market like South Africa, you'd want that to be at 50%. And so that is very concerning. And that has put us in a position where, at the end of the day, I think you've indicated that in terms when you look at the total spend that we're spending, because I was looking at the numbers just now, you'd find that 340.5 billion is actually earmarked for debt servicing costs during the 2023-24 year. And if you go forward, it's expected to continue going up. So if you look at the outer end of the medium-term economic framework, which is in 2025-26. It's expected to be at 397. So even the National Treasury itself is basically saying that we are somewhat in this form of a trap. And why is that happening? So we're applauding the National Treasury for doing something at Eskom, and you say that it was inevitable they have to do it because the cost was too large. But obviously what's going to happen now is that the take on of debt from Eskom is going to make our debt trajectory worse than it was projected about a year ago. So initially, the National Treasury was expecting our debt to stabilize, I think, in about a year or so. Now it's expected to be pushed out because of the 254 billion. It's less than 254 billion because 66 billion was already budgeted for in the previous framework. But the additional debt that the government is going to be taking on its balance sheet is going to increase this debt. And what it's doing is, when you look at South Africa at the end of the day, what are the ramifications? Is that if you look at 330 billion, if it was used, say, for social services, it could have easily covered, the basic income grant that, a lot of people are crying for, to say that we need to support, some of the sections of our society. It could easily do that. Of course, there'll be some top up that will be done, but it's quite a lot of money. So it's and again, I think for us, when you look at, because obviously we have to look at the gross domestic products of a country, and if you just take that money and say, okay, fine, let's direct it maybe to capital expenditures, which is one area that we have been lacking. So if you look at the amount that we're putting into the capital projects, it's being crowded out by these debt servicing costs. It's being crowded out by the normal recurrent expenditures. We're talking about the public service wage bill that you have to pay. All those things, at times that are not, directly resulting, that have got a lower multiplier when it comes to the GDP where we're putting the money. We could have been putting it into capital projects. So it's quite a problem, I think, that we're facing. But I mean going back to what the National Treasury is trying to do, which is the reason why they're trying to rein in their expenditure to make sure that they can balance that. But we still have a long way for us to get out of that trap.
Well, Thoko is a social activist, and I'm sure this is an issue that is very close to your heart. Now, I'm just looking at Maimani's comment. To grow our economy, we have to grow our middle class. The middle class is the driver of economic growth. Our middle class has been shrinking over the years and become indebted. To stimulate growth, the budget must stimulate and grow the shrinking middle class. And this was exactly the point that I was going to make with you, Thoko, where we are an extremely unequal society, of two extremes in this country. And the question of middle class that was raised in that point as well, where we find that the middle class is disappearing. And the key issue here is it's about economic and social justice, which is a topic which is very, very close to your heart. And I'm not too sure how much of that actually reflected in the budget that was presented today.
I think it's a mixed bag, right? So on the one hand, we welcome the extension of the social relief of distress grant. It was necessary. But we also need to, if we're going to talk about and complain about compensation of employees, whether in private or in public, then we're talking about people who are earning incomes that are not growing in real terms. So a cut in the public sector often is reflected by cuts in the private sector. So we have a flattening out of wages across the board. And so if we don't have a collective, a social contract to say that we agree that paying people a living wage is important, and paying people a living wage in the context where we don't have the jobs and will not have the jobs because of the structural nature of our economy, because of the legacy that we have come through from colonialism to apartheid to now, we need a clear picture of saying people deserve money in the bank to be able to participate in this economy. So that means public servants and private workers. And so we're seeing, just looking on the public side, because that's what we're focusing on, we're seeing at the lower level real cuts to public service wages. That means those public servants who pay taxes or who used to qualify to pay for taxes, depending on their threshold, they might now be below the tax threshold, because this is what it means in real terms. That means we are removing the possibility of them engaging in the economy and removing the possibility of recouping the rewards of them engaging in the economy. And so, as somebody who is interested in dealing with inequality, it's both the inequality between the public sector and the private sector. It's the inequality in the private sector. We have to be blunt about this. Large companies do not pay decent wages at the lower levels. We have what is known as the working poor, people who are working and qualify for grants. So not everybody who gets a grant is unemployed. These are employed people who need to augment their meager salaries with further additions from the state. And we need the private sector to come on board and say, yes, we commit to giving our workers real above inflation increases. We are committing to ensuring that they can be taxpayers. If they are employed by us, we want them to be taxpayers. It's the same in the public sector. We want to make sure that the bulk, not the top, because there is inequality within the public sector, absolutely. But I'm talking about the bulk, the frontline workers, your nurses, your porters, your security guards, so people who are working at front line in our services, at the school teachers, that they are able to earn incomes, are given incomes or provided with incomes that enable them to deliver a public service and to engage in the economy. So with a slowing down and with a clamping down, we are reducing the ability of the majority of South Africans, and I think this is really important, to engage meaningfully in the economic activity that we want people to engage in. And we want to be able to know that people are well fed, are looked after, are able to access resources, are able to access basic services like water and electricity. And, one of the real kind of concerns about this budget is that when we talk about a cut to the social wage, when you reduce services and the quality of services in the public sector, some families will opt out and go into private. That is their choice, but that's further loss to the public sector. But also, you have a situation where the quality that is needed gets eroded, and so we lose people out of the public sector itself, and an unwillingness to work in the public sector. And so we have a real ticking time bomb when it comes to literacy in this country. The reading panel has given their outcomes of what children are able to read for meaning, and it's very, 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 very low, which has a huge impact on our long-term thinking. So part of what we would argue, is that this budget is short-term thinking. It's not long-term thinking. Yes, absolutely, in the short term, Eskom has to be dealt with. But in the long term, a child's ability to read is critical if we're going to talk about engaging in economic activity down the line.
Yes, but also, Orin, whether the budget is short or long term, it requires political will. And this is reinforced by this comment that's coming up on screen now, saying, I don't understand why Treasury has to allocate 1 billion to rescue SAA, privatizes nonsensical airline. It's not like it benefits the poor masses. Now, that is just one example when we are talking about the lack of political will to do something. SAA, the whole business rescue saga that had played out for a long time, and now a further bailout is just one example of a lack of political will. And also at the same time, sometimes hard decisions need to be made. in the interests of the country. And this is exactly what Thoko has been alluding to at the end of the day, is you need to give confidence not only to the investors, you need to not only give confidence to business, but you need to give confidence to the people, to the masses in the country. And this is extremely important. Also, at the same time, taking a look at every time the president says something, it appears as if it's going the other way. He gave the State of the Nation address. In fact, we're actually worse off now with load shedding since the State of the Nation address. So, again, these are, we're talking about numbers and statistics and all these fancy numbers that have come out in the budget and percentages and billions and trillions. Those mean absolutely nothing until there is this political will to actually do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think that there are times when you listen to the president himself and some of his ministers in terms of some of the policies that they are rolling out, it feels like just coming off the cuff, So if you go back to SONA, for instance, the president indicated that. When he talked about the need for the country to have that minister of electricity, it was presented as an urgent issue. But right now, I don't know how many days after the SONA, and there's no mention in terms of the creation of that particular ministry. And there's got a lot of things. And also, when you look at, we are in a crisis sort of mode. So most of the solutions that are being put on the table, they do appear to be short-term in nature. For instance, when you look at the energy crisis, it's one area that you don't want to go wrong. Because if you start making decisions because you're under pressure, you end up jeopardizing your long-term ability to have that energy security. So it's something that has been going on, and I think probably it goes back to during even President Zuma's period. In some cases, you find incoherence within the ministers themselves. You find that one minister comes out and say one thing, or the president comes out and say one thing, and then it's being disputed by somebody else. So you can basically see that the cabinet at times doesn't speak from the same book. They all have got different ways, and that talks to the fact that you probably do not have a coherent policy, because if you've got a coherent policy that everybody who is an implementer of that policy, they should be able to speak with one voice, and we're seeing that it's not actually happening. And I think just going back to the comment that you raised in terms of the South African Airways, and I think that's one thing that boggles mind for a lot of people to just understand why the government cannot just let go a state-owned enterprise like South African Airways. It has no value to the government. We understand that, when it comes to certain state-owned enterprises like Eskom, for instance, an argument can be made to say that Eskom is a strategic asset for the country. And it's one area that somebody can say you don't want to privatize. You want the government to actually be behind the supply of energy. Even though we've seen in other countries that some governments have been able to privatize electricity generation in some parts of the provision of electricity. So looking at a lot of these SOEs, I mean, there's some that can be viable. I mean, I'm thinking of a state-owned enterprise like Transnet, for example. It's one of the most important it's one of the most important entity within the South African economic system, because it's pretty much your supply and logistics sort of center of the economy that can operate viably and profitably. The question has always been, why is the government, why does it continue hanging on to such an entity? There's quite a lot of them. And if you go back 3-4 years ago, again, I think I go back to some of the initial promises that were made by President Ramaphosa. One of the key issues was we're going to really look at the portfolio of the state-owned enterprise that we have. We're going to restructure and say which are the critical ones and which are not. And the ones that are not critical are probably we're going to let them go. But I understand, I mean, it's more a political and ideological issue. There is entities like COSATU. Obviously, I don't think they would ever agree to the sale of some of these as the state-owned enterprises. But at some point, like you were saying, we have to make the very difficult, hard decisions to say the government cannot continue pumping money to entities that should be operating profitably. We've got so many airlines that are operating profitably. Why is the South African Airways not operating profitably? And why is the government continuously pumping money into this bottomless pit? So it's some of those things I think that are holding us back. And yeah, it's a pity that when it comes to policy, it doesn't look like there is a long-term vision or a long-term policy. So for instance, we look at other countries. So if you look at China, for a very good example, other Asian countries, and what you can see is that they've got a 10-year, 20-year policy framework. So what's happening now is something that was designed maybe 15 years ago. And when you look at South Africa, you don't quite see that. It's every time when the president comes, he probably says something which is contradicting what he said previously. So we're having that kind of, I think, issues when it comes to framing our policies to grow the economy.
Yes, and also, Thoko, I think when we talk about social justice, what is important to understand is this is supposed to give hope to people, especially to young people, their future in the country. And when one looks at the climate under which this budget was presented, and looking at South Africa since 1994, 29 years down the line, where we've had young people that have been through the entire system, and 29 years later, they are still in serious doubt and they have serious concerns as to whether they really have a future in this country or not.
Yes, I read just recently that 14-year-olds in this country don't know a world without load shedding. So it's important to remember the climate under which our next generation, and I completely agree with Orin around the policy uncertainty. We really do need a kind of lachotla or coming together where we say, right, let's think creatively. It's almost like tearing up the National Development Plan and restarting and saying, we're going to start from this point and look to 20 years and do so realistically and in a way that prioritizes what I would argue an economy that is sustainable, that is green, and that prioritizes those that are most in need. And currently, we don't have that. And we're seeing that in the budget numbers. We're seeing that Treasury is having to walk a tightrope or pull a rabbit out of a hat to be able to allocate in ways that the policy areas are not clear. So I've spoken about industrial policy. They mention it, but it's very kind of, it's not clear exactly what will happen, especially because, as Orin has said, the bulk of the finances under that infrastructure fund is going towards debt repayments and not real economy actions and activities. And so, as a young, thinking of young people reflecting on today's budget, they really should be demanding that there's a serious rethink, a political rethink about our fiscal consolidation policy. This is absolutely, is it suitable for our needs? Put everything on the table, our debt, our deficits, there's a modern monetary theory talks about the deficit myth, that somehow we needn't be so scared about deficits, especially if it means in the long term, in the long run, it will drive economic growth. And when we're talking about economic growth, we're wanting to make sure we're talking about the right kinds of growth. So not extractive, that ruins and damages the environment, but ones that are circular, that build on what's happening in townships. There are strong township economies that just need to be boosted, that need to have access to markets, that need to be able to access the regional markets as well. So there's a lot of creativity that just needs to be unplugged. But under this pressure that we're seeing, and some of it rightly so, because of the state of the nature and form of state capture under the Zuma administration, that has really clipped the wings of what is possible. But at the same time, we shouldn't give up on what is possible, and we should be able to have a conversation about: is our tax system just? Is it fair? those who have, are they really paying their fair share? People who live in these 14, 15 million euro or $15 million houses in Sandton or Camps Bay, are they paying their fair share in property taxes? You know, there are ways in which we could be leveraging the wealth that this country has, because people, I mean, there's a lot of money in this country. We just need to leverage it so that it is benefiting the majority of South Africans, as opposed to this tiny sliver at the top. And that calls for political will, like you've spoken about. It is an ideological question, but it's beautiful that these budget documents can throw up these questions, because it shows that there's grappling, that tension is there, and we just need to have frank conversations about the rands and cents at the end of the day that aren't reaching the poorest of the poor. So, you know, essentially, this budget is expecting the impossible of the poor, quite frankly. And we should be giving them as much as we can, and it's expecting the impossible of young people, and it should be giving them the best that we can.
Well, yes, and also, Oren, when one looks at developments that have been playing out at local government level, and yeah, the likelihood and the possibility is there that even at the national level, some of these issues will be playing out, like, for instance, coalition governments. And we've seen what local government, coalitions that have never worked. We see mayors being putted out and coming back and putted out again. And these are issues that have been playing up, which is not healthy at a local level for service delivery and the like, whether we're talking about potholes or refuse removal or whatever it is. And managing a budget of trillions, at a national level. And when you are going to be faced with a situation where possibly you may have a coalition government, this is where, again, we are talking about political maturity in our democracy, which is needed in this country if we want to take this country forward.
Yeah, totally. I think the specter of having a coalition government at national level in 2024 is something that scares quite a lot of investors. Under normal circumstances, having a coalition is not a bad thing. It allows governments to have compromises. So if you look at most of Europe, it's basically governed under coalitions. So you look at Germany, you look at the UK, but there are normal functioning economies because they know how to manage those coalitions, and also just the point that you have alluded to, that there is political maturity. But for South Africa, I think the experience so far hasn't been that great. We started having the coalition, I think it was in the Nelson Mandela Bay. And that municipality until now is one of the most dysfunctional municipality. Then it came to Gauteng. We had it here in Johannesburg. I live in Johannesburg. I don't even know. I mean, mayors we have had since maybe 2016. Lots of them. I don't even know the current mayor. I'm sorry. So we've got all those issues because they're changing every week. And you go to Tshwane, is the same problem. And I think what this is also presenting, if you just want to be more pragmatic about it, what this is presenting is the fact that every time you have that dysfunction at the political level, then you start having problems at the operational level as well, in terms of the delivery of services to people. So you look at Tshwane, for example. It used to be somewhat a functioning municipality, but at the moment, because of these coalitions that are not working, recently the report that came from the Attorney General was quite damning in terms of tens of billions of rands, essentially some sort of wasteful expenditure, some money not being able to be accounted for. So it creates that platform for rampant corruption, which is quite a big concern. So and as we are sitting from where we are as a country, I think one of the biggest risks that we're facing is the municipalities, and thinking that we're going to have a similar scenario at the national government is even scarier for investors particularly.
Well, certainly, and just I think final thoughts from your side, Thoko, and we'll get to Orin as well. We've got about a minute each.
Yeah, I think, this budget has thrown up a lot of questions, and those questions need to be discussed seriously. I think the fiscal consolidation path that is currently being pursued should be debated, given our developmental needs. And it's a pity that the trade-offs that have been made have resulted in real cuts to the social wage. It's a real indictment on Treasury, on government, because at this present moment, South Africans need more good, decent public services, not less.
Thank you for that, Orin.
Yeah, so I think for me, maybe just to end with what I feel is a bit of disappointment for me. We did talk about the fact that the government needs to have long-term planning, and you can basically see it if you analyze like what's happening in this particular budget, particularly when you look at the incentives, the tax measures that have been put in place, for businesses and individuals to be able to procure renewable energy. I mean, you have to think deep and say, maybe there's about 20 to 30 billion that's going to go into this particular industry. But where is that money going to go to? It's most likely to go to China. It's probably going to go to many other countries. But if you're a government that is long-term focused, we could have put measures to make sure that, we have created that capacity. We're not saying that we can manufacture everything, but there's some things that we can do locally. But right now we don't have it. So all this money that's coming through is basically going to be shipped out. It's not going to create jobs in South Africa. We're just going to get the peripheral jobs of installations and things like that. So I think that kind of long-term thinking is needed, for the country to be able to deal with some of the problems that we're currently facing.
Well, I must say it's been most absorbing having both of you as part of the panel discussion this evening. Thoko Madonko, a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, and Orin Tambo, head of investment strategy at 274. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we wish you well. And yes, at some point in time, I'm sure we will revisit this discussion to see whether the speech today and also the numbers, they reflect to reality in terms of what we are actually going to see, because at the end of the day, this is going to be measured over the next few months, and let's see how things pan out. But for now, thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this evening's broadcast on Wednesday nights with myself, Inequality, and I must say it's been most absorbing and interesting to see the take on the budget, and that's coming through from various quarters. And we obviously will be doing a lot more analysis, a lot more coverage on the budget on our programs, and particularly on the morning news and views programs. And it'll be interesting to see how other political players actually see this budget, how does the likes of trade unions, youth organizations, but it is clear that the budget addressed the most critical issue, which is ESCOM, and looking at short-term solutions. But what is important is to look at this country in the long term. And again, it's about confidence to investors, confidence to the people of the country, the population, the future, the youth of this country, who think at this point in time that they have a very bleak and a dark future in this country. So with that, I'm going to be taking leave of you, and it's been wonderful being in your company, in the company of our listeners, our viewers on the various platforms of Salam Media. We wish you well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.